Today I want to talk about God being the provider. God the provider. And I know that in our lives we're sometimes afraid. Sometimes we're not sure of the next step. Have you guys encountered like a fork where you got to choose, where do I go? What do I do? How do I do it? Do I do this or that thing? Well, Roxy and I are kind of at a similar fork where we're making choices that significantly impact our life with the house purchase and other things. And fear can be very real, and fear can be very present in your life when you make big life decisions. And what I want to say to you guys and what I want to go through today and kind of talk about is that God will provide. Jehovah Jireh, God will provide. And the questions are very simple. I always like to begin my sermons with questions. Are you afraid today? Or are you intimidated by something today? And do you ask yourself a question, does God really see me? Does God really care about the things I'm going through and the things that happen to me and the things that I want and things that I need and things I care about? Does He care? Where is God? And it's very important for us to stop right here and to make a very distinct distinction between want and need. Because some of us spoiled kids have begun to think that the word want also means word need. And they're very different words. Because you need food and water to survive and you want to eat, we might begin to think that, those words mean the same thing. And that's why you hear some 10-year-olds come forward and say, I want an Apple Watch. And you say, no. And they say, I want an Apple Watch. And it's like the end of the world if they don't get it. This is just an example. I don't know no 10-year-old that does that, but I'm sure there are cases. It is important for us to understand the difference between want and need. Because God provides for your needs. And God knows what you need. And sometimes we think that what we want is what we need. And God, why aren't you providing for all my wants? Do you realize that God funds His projects? God led us to it. He'll lead us through it, we always say, right? God's will, God's bill. God funds His project. God takes care of His church. God always provides for the church. God loves His people. And the purpose of your life is not to go about your wants. And God is not just this magic wand or magic stick that you could just say, I want, and bam, you have it. God gives you what you need when you need it, and He knows you so much better than you know yourself. And that's why I want to talk today about God being a God, a provider for our needs when we need them, in a time that He thinks is fitting. I have a guy friend who thinks he's never going to get married. Guy just has no luck. I'm not pointing fingers. It's nobody here. And more than often, girls have this fear. What if I'm never chosen? What if I never get married? Let me tell you something. God knows you very well. Did you know that Jesus said that even your hair is counted? How well does God know you? We sometimes think that God is this being that's super far away. He's running the stars. And His throne is somewhere far away, because it says that, the heavens is God's throne and the earth is the footstool. So that means God, is somewhere far. He just kind of just leans His foot on the earth. I don't know how you imagine it. and other things like that make us think that, because God runs this tremendously big universe, and because the sun is so big, and because everything around us is so grand, we begin to think and imagine that God is somewhere out there far away. And it's hard for us people who are in one place at a specific time to imagine a God who is everywhere at once. It is difficult for us to imagine a God like that. But God is omnipresent. God is present in your circumstance. God is present in your life. God is present in your worry. And God cares. Let's read something. Romans 8:28. It says, it's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. I use it at least a couple times a year. And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. I'm reading the NLT translation. You can read any, really. And here it says that no matter what happens in your life, no matter what happens in your life, it's for good. But there's a but there, or not really, but there's a contingency there. There's like something that you got to do before that applies to your life, right? It says, for those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. That means if you love God, and if you're living out whatever ministry or whatever task or whatever thing God puts you in, if you're living that out, if you're applying your life to God's calling for your life, then no matter what happens in your life, do not be afraid and do not be worried. Just lay it at the feet of Jesus. Whether it's the program you can't get into, whether it's that job that you want, you don't know if you need. Lord knows if you need it. Whether it's a spouse, lay it at the feet of Jesus and pursue Jesus. How did Alex used to always say? He said, dance with Jesus and something, and let the right man cut in. Dance with Jesus until the right man cuts in, or something like that. So dance with Jesus, and He will provide for you in everything. I want to quickly just reference a story. We're not going to read it. It's a story of Abraham and Isaac. Do you guys remember God told Abraham that you have to go to a mountain that I point to you and sacrifice your son upon that mountain? Me now about to have a kid, that's kind of scary. I don't know if I'd give that up. But whatever God tells you to do, you have to give up and do without fear. And what happens is Abraham obeys God and it counts to him as righteousness, and God provides. God provides a substitute. God provided for Abraham by having a ram in a thorn bush, get stuck, and Isaac continues to live. And this is the place where God is named Jehovah-Jireh. This is where Abraham calls God Jehovah-Jireh, or God the provider. If we read the authentic, Hebrew Bible, it means Lord will provide. But more directly, what it means is the Lord will see to it. The Lord will see to it. And I like that it says it that way. Because what that's telling you is God sees you. Maybe indirectly, but what it's saying is God sees you. And because God sees your circumstance, He will see to it that you will win, that you will prosper, that whatever you're going through, you will win. And God saw to it that Isaac, the promise, the blessing of Abraham, made it out alive, and a substitute was put in place. This is an analogy for Jesus with a thorn on His head, right? Like the ram. So I just want to look at like 4 or 5 basic things in our life that God provides for. And hopefully give you this assurance, hopefully convince you that God truly does care for you, God truly does see you, and God truly does work for you. And I'm going to pick and choose a bunch of stories out of the Old and New Testament, and we will just see how God does his thing. Is that okay with everyone? Let's do it. All right. So there are needs that we have. Let's acknowledge we all have needs, right? Every one of us has needs. And the basic needs are like air to breathe. How long can you go without air? Not very long. And if you didn't have much of it, and 8 minutes later, you're a goner. Unless Jesus intervenes. Then we need food, right? Without food, we can go a little longer. Without water, a little less, but not as little as without air. These are all essentials. And then shelter and clothing, like to stay warm. Does that make sense? To keep ourselves away from the elements. We need these things in order to remain alive, to stay alive. And through these Bible stories, we're going to see how God provides for his people. And a very first one, air. I love this part. Genesis 2:7. So close. Genesis 2:7. Now, almost in the beginning, God's already providing. Check this out. Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. He breathed the breath of life into a man's nostrils, and the man became a living person. God breathed the breath of life into the nostrils of man, and the man became a living person. I was listening to scientists talk, and they're explaining how they're trying to create life. They mix a bunch of elements together, a bunch of things, all these ingredients and all this energy and some sparks too. They add to it, and at the end, it turns out to be some kind of gooey substance that hopefully will, they think, become an amoeba or some kind of living creature that will move or do something or twitch, and they can prove that evolution works. I want to point out a famous person who lived in 1800s. It's Louis Pasteur. He was a French biologist, microbiologist, chemist, renowned for his discoveries in the principles of vaccination, microbial fermentation, and pasteurization. He made a bunch of breakthroughs basically in a medical field. And one of the things he believed in is that only life creates life, and he has it almost like made like a law and or a principle. And this is one of the things he argued in genobiasis, something like Genesis biology, something like that. Anyway, creation biology. And he says that only life can create life. We see this happen all around us, like trees, right? Trees can create life because they're alive. And then we see humans and animals. But you never see rocks create life, except one. But then, just kidding. But back to the point. Only life creates life. And when we go back to our beginning, where did we come from? We came from something living, right? Our parents. Where do our parents come from? Grandparents. And so we go back and back and back and back and back and back and back. And for some reason, people seem to think that, the very first one wasn't the living thing. And that's really breaking the principle. Saying that, it rained on the rocks and it became a soup, and the soup started moving and found something to eat and something to marry. And here we are. It just doesn't work. But when we look at the fact that only life creates life today in the world, scientists still can't create life out of themselves, out of mixing chemicals together and all these things together. They cannot create life, but the original life comes from God himself. God is a living thing, a living person, living being. God is a character who is alive. And if God breathed air into the person, well, then it just makes sense that only life creates life, right? It just makes sense that that's the way it works. And so only life can create life. Biogenesis, there you go. So the question is, how am I alive today? Where do I come from? And how does this work? Well, the living and loving God who provides the very basic necessities for me so that I would not be afraid and I would be sure in Him, has breathed life into me. He's given me air to breathe. And I'm able to be alive today. He first did it to Adam and Eve. And generations and years later, here we are. All of us, right? Job says in chapter 33, verse 4, "For the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life." So God provides us with everything, and I was listing off simple things, and the first one is air. Air is very often affiliated with life. So God gives you life. As simple as that. The second thing I picked was food. The Bible talks about the food probably the most of all the things that is provided. From the examples of feeding the 5,000 to Elijah and a food that doesn't run out, and Elijah being fed by crows, and Israel going through the desert and being fed from heaven. Just a ton of examples. And Jesus becomes this new living bread, right? Also in the New Testament, He says, "My flesh is, the bread, and my drink is the wine. My blood is the wine. That is the true food and the true drink." Let's see how people who don't trust God start demanding things from God. Yeah, maybe they get things from God, but it's not a good thing. Exodus 16, verse 11. Exodus 16:11. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening vast numbers of quail flew in and covered the camp. And the next morning the area around the camp was wet with dew. When the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. "What is it?" they asked each other. They had no idea what it was. And Moses told them, "This is the food the Lord has given you to eat. This is manna." Oh, I added the manna part myself. It's not there. This is manna. So that's what it is. So the Lord has provided food for His people, even the disobedient people. What's interesting about God is He's such a loving God that He provides even the people who aren't following God. He takes care of them and loves them, and hoping that we will do our job. So what I want to get out of this story is Israelites were constantly complaining. They were fighting. Moses was saying, they're trying to stone me already. They were always in disagreement. They were always grumbling and rumbling, and they weren't happy. And they were saying, maybe we should go back to Egypt. Maybe we should go back to where we came from, back into the slavery, because at least we had food there. Just remember that God provides even when it seems impossible. We're so used to always having a job. We're so used to always having the same amount of money pop up in our bank account. And we're so used to our parents always be there for us and our friends being there for us. And that's kind of our comfort zone. It's almost like our Egypt. And we get comfortable. Yes, Egypt was slavery, but we got comfortable to the lifestyle. We had this food. And now it's cut off. You lose a job. Something happens. Wow, what's going on? My life is out of whack. I don't understand. Just remember this. God is a God provider in all the times. In the difficult times, in the easy times. And when things seem impossible, God is still there. God still cares for you. God still provides. I always like to go back to the story of Gideon, like the impossible story. The impossible story. Gideon was just listening to God word and word. Whatever God said, Gideon did. And he ended up beating a crazy army with almost no man. Impossible. But God provides a victory in the impossible if you rely on God, if you serve God, if you do as He say, if you love Him. Romans 8:28. Let's go back. All things happen for good, those who love God and live according to His purpose. We're going to move on. But this is what God asks Job when Job was complaining to God that all these things happened to him and he lost so many things, and he lost his kids and he lost his camels and donkeys, and Job was broke and sick and he had nothing left, and he's asking God, why is all this happening to me? And God just shows him that he takes care of the whole world. God never really gives Job an answer. He just kind of points and says that, I know what I'm doing. That's kind of the point of the story of Job. Is like, God's like, I know what I'm doing. Just trust me. And this is what he says in chapter 38, verse 39. Job 38:39. Can you stalk prey for a lioness and satisfy the young lion's appetites as they lie in their den or crouch in a thicket? Who provides food for the ravens when their young cry out to God and wander about in hunger? That's it. That's the end of the chapter. God provides for us in every way because He's a good and loving God. And yes, sometimes it seems impossible. Sometimes we might lose everything. But just remember that if you're faithful to God through ups and downs, He will lead you to greater glory. He will lead you to where you belong. And you will live out your purpose if you're following God's plan and not your own. Water. Let's talk about water, another basic necessity. There's a lot to say about water in the New and the Old Testament. Israel also complains here and doesn't depend on God because it also seems so impossible. Out of all the places that Moses could have led him, and that's what they're saying, out of all the places you could have led us, Moses, for us to have water, you said we're going to have milk and honey. Where's the honey at? Where's the water? You led us into the desert. We've been wandering in circles in the desert. This is the worst place to have water. This is impossible to have water. It's the desert because there is no water. And you led us here. And this is how they complain. Let's read Exodus 17:3. Exodus 17:3 and on. But tormented by thirst, they continued to argue with Moses. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Are you trying to kill us, our children, our livestock with thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what should I do with these people? They are ready to stone me. Yeah, that's the part I was talking about. I keep saying these things, but what I want to say today is we might be afraid. We might be uncomfortable. Things might seem like they're falling apart. Things might seem very uncomfortable. If you love God and live out His purpose, don't worry. That's all I'm trying to say today. If you love God and you're living according to His purpose, don't worry. He's got you. And if you're not living according to His purpose, well, then you got derailed somewhere. You need to hop back on the tracks. Hop back on the tracks. Allow Jesus to put you on the right path. The Lord said to Moses, walk out in front of the people. Take your staff, the one you used when you struck the water of the Nile, and call some of the elders of Israel to join you. I will stand before you on the rock at Mount Sinai. Strike the rock, and water will come out gushing. Then the people will be able to drink. So Moses struck the rock as he was told, and water gushed out, and the elders looked on. As the elders looked on. And I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about is, how God provides for you in clothing and in shelter. It's like, yes, we cannot live without water, we cannot live without air, we cannot live without food. But God is God really so meticulous that He would provide for you in your clothing? Does God really care that much? Maybe some of us still don't trust God enough and don't understand that God delights in the details of your life. And He makes the details of your life so fine so that you would go exactly where you need to go. And sometimes we still don't trust Him. If you think God doesn't care in detail, well, maybe you will care after this. Shelter and clothing. Who was the first clothing maker in the Bible? God. Genesis 3:21, and the Lord God made clothing from animal skins for Adam and his wife. God made some leather clothing. He had style too. If you think God doesn't care about that, he does. And, oh man, I didn't add it. There's another verse in the Bible. Oh, maybe it's right here. Deuteronomy 29:5. For 40 years I led you through the wilderness. This is Moses speaking. Yet your clothes and your sandals did not wear out. Isn't that crazy? For 40 years. Man, I walk to my car and my shoes wear out after 2 years. For 40 years walking through the desert, the rocks, the heat and the cold, the rain and the elements, and they did not wear out, the clothing nor the shoes. If you think God doesn't care about you after I just read all these things and showed you all these things, I don't know what else to tell you. But what I can tell you is the same God, the living God who created life, who created Adam and Eve, and generation and years later, that same God still cares about his people. He cares about you. He cares about the details of your life. And he tells you today to not be worried. All you need to do is surrender your life, and you'll see how much easier it is after you surrender your life, how everything, it's almost like everything is falling into place. I'm sure there's a verse for that too. So that same God that sometimes seems so distant, the God that runs the stars. You guys should read that, Job 38, I think it was, the whole chapter. You guys will like it, where God talks about what he runs. He talks about the stars and the constellations and everything. So don't see God as somebody just, too busy running the universe, because God is omnipresent. God is present everywhere at once. And what I like is when Simon Peter was thinking that. Simon Peter's thinking, that God has this master plan, and God is somewhere out there, and I wish I could see God. And he comes up to Jesus and he says, Jesus, show us the Father. You know what Jesus replies? This whole time I'm with you, Peter, and you have not recognized me. This whole time I've been with you, Peter, and you thought I'm somewhere far away. That same God is today in this place, is here. He's speaking. He wants you to not be afraid. He wants you to surrender your life to him wholly, not partially, not leave little avenues out, but surrender to him wholly, and you'll see when you live out his purpose how grand and wonderful God is, how he provides for you in every way. I'll be the first one to testify for that. If anybody knows my story, how if you surrender to God, he'll just give you everything you could ever desire. Gave me the house, took away my bills, gave me a wife, a beautiful wife, gave me a child, gave me a position, gave me an awesome job. If you surrender your life to God, just try it. You'll see how wonderful your life gets. Some people think it's just rules. Christian life is just rules. Go ahead, brother. Some people think, the Christian life is just full of rules. That's all it is just limiting your life. I kid you not that you're limiting and cutting your life short if you don't serve God. But if you surrender yourself to God, it's the best thing you could ever do in your life. And it's the thing you were made to do. Fellowship God. Encounter God. That's it. Hope those biblical examples were good. I could use so many more, How Sarah, who wasn't able to give birth, gave birth. How Noah just floated above the destruction. How Gideon won the battle. How David won his battles against, giants and in his youth. And I can go on and on and on. So many examples of how God will provide for you against the impossible odds.